Hi, everybody. I'm Charlie Kravitz, General Manager of WBUR. I'm delighted to see you all here tonight. Thank you all for joining us to celebrate the opening of CitySpace, WBUR's new home for public conversation in Boston. I want to especially welcome members of WBUR's Edward R. Murrow Society who help sustain our work with their generosity in very meaningful ways. Tonight, we also celebrate you and your contributions to making CitySpace a reality. Starting in 1939, Americans heard on the radio what could only have been considered a miracle. Live reports from the rooftops of London by Edward R. Murrow during the German Blitz, which was intended to bomb the city and country into submission. Those reports defined the power and impact of broadcast journalism for generations and helped to bring us to this day. It is a long way from the rooftops of London in 1939 to the stage of CitySpace in Boston in 2019. 80 years have passed, and the world we live in hardly resembles the one our forebears lived through, a Second World War that took the lives of more than 50 million people around the world. But the urgency to know, to understand, and to connect with each other is every bit as essential now as it was 80 years ago. And WBUR harnesses that oldest of broadcast technology, radio, every day to reach 5 people in Boston and millions across America. Back at the dawn of radio, people huddled around their radios, which were big pieces of furniture, to listen to Murrow and the fireside chats of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Today, it could be argued we live in somewhat more isolated lives, glued to our screens at home, on the streets, and at work, connected by the internet, but alone in our communal experiences. The revolutionary technology of the digital age, which is really only about 20 years old since we were introduced to the World Wide Web, has transformed our lives, in many ways for the better, but as is often the case with technology, that transformation has brought deep complications of isolation, invasions of privacy, and hunger for human connection. As the digital age has changed our lives, so too has it changed WBUR. We cannot be content to simply reach people through radio. Indeed, we have embraced a strategy we call FutureCast to meet the future by providing our content however and wherever our listeners and users demand it and need it. So tonight, we celebrate the power of community, the elemental hunger to come together, and the essential American instinct to share our destiny, debate our future, embrace artistic expression, and celebrate the power of ideas to guide us to a better world. CitySpace at the Levine Broadcast Center is our new home for community and the tangible experiences that will enrich Boston and all our lives. It is a logical extension of our work at WBUR and a place where the skills we harness in radio, web, social media, podcast, and more will find new expression. Every event at WBUR WBUR CitySpace can now be streamed live from our 6-camera 4K HD video system right here, and archived for on-demand viewing later. We've built CitySpace to be flexible, easy to use, and inexpensive to run, so that we can experiment and partner with organizations across the region to create fantastic in-person experiences. Even this stage I'm standing on can go flat to the floor or rise like magic with a button push to adjust for the different needs of daily gatherings at CitySpace. And this magnificent screen behind me can be used for everything from showing movies and documentaries to PowerPoints and photography. None of this would be possible without the generosity of so many of you gathered here tonight. I'd like to especially thank some of the people whose names you see on our beautiful donor wall in the CitySpace lobby. They include Jeannie and Jonathan Levine, Beckenstein, the Barr Foundation, Paul and Patty Gannon, Penny and Bruns Grayson, Ron O'Hanley, Bill Kalatis, and Liz and Phil Gross, among many others. Two names you will find way up high on that donor wall are Margot and John Davis. Their exceptional generosity prompted us to put their name on the entrance to this hall, the Davis Family Theater. John, who is one of the most important real estate developers in Boston and the country, played a pivotal role in advising me on the creation of this beautiful space. John and Margot also opened their home and their hearts to this effort, for which I am forever grateful. I'm delighted now to introduce John Davis, the co-chair of the Campaign for WBUR, to publicly share details with you. Please welcome John Davis.
I don't often get to see my name in lights, so, or electrons or whatever it is. Thanks, Charlie. It's wonderful to welcome you all here tonight for this celebration of the opening of CitySpace and for what I think we all know will be a fascinating conversation. I'm delighted to be able to serve together with my wife Margot as co-chairs of the first ever capital campaign in WBUR's history. I want to acknowledge our fellow co-chairs, all of whom have the night off tonight, lucky for them. Corey and Anya Thomas, Freddie and Howard Stevenson, Patty and Paul Gannon, and Bill Kalados. For almost 70 years, WBUR has been the go-to voice for the arts, culture, current affairs, and the politics of the city, the nation, and the world. Along the way, BUR's programming has evolved, but the mission of service to the community that it embraces has never wavered. Of course, it's hard to call what's going on in the world of media today evolution. We're in a time of seismic change. Much of it is wonderful. You could literally access the entire world back to the dawn of time from your phone. But there has been enormous cost. Media outlets everywhere are under tremendous strain. Over the last 10 years, 15,000 journalists have lost their jobs. The profession is in crisis. Journalism is at the core of a strong democracy. It has to be protected. Given these circumstances, WBUR and the community it serves were truly lucky that Charlie Kravitz came along 10 years ago. Under Charlie's leadership, we are in the process of transforming WBUR as he described and reimagining the way that it serves Boston and the nation. Through this visionary transformation, WBUR's thoughtful journalism and creative programming is serving our citizens on a much broader stage with far greater impact. Proof of the success of this effort is the fact that in a time of turmoil in the media generally, WBUR is growing and thriving. But the kinds of changes that we're undertaking under Charlie's leadership involve very significant investment. Tonight, I'm proud to announce the kickoff of the public phase of our $40 million campaign for WBUR. And it is with great excitement that I share that we have raised $28 million, fully 70% of our goal during the quiet phase of this campaign. Having been involved with many fundraising efforts over the years, as I know many of you have, I think it's worth considering what an extraordinary achievement that is, what an endorsement it reflects of the central role that WBUR plays in the life of our community, and how deeply we all rely on it. Considering that 5 years ago, the largest gift that WBUR had ever received was $50,000, and there were only a handful of those. The fact that during the quiet phase of our campaign, we've already received 10 gifts in excess of $500,000 and 8 gifts of $1 million or more speaks volumes. At the core of our plan, we're investing in journalism and content, especially in underreported areas such as the environment, and in time and cost-intensive areas such as investigative journalism. And we're developing new original programming and podcasts. As an aside, WBUR is experiencing 8 million downloads of its podcasts every month. As masters of the craft of audio, we have a unique competitive position in this burgeoning new media vertical. We're also embracing other opportunities of the digital age by delivering our content on new platforms such as live streams, apps, social media, and more. By investing in innovation, technology, and the people and skills required to execute these new strategies, we're ensuring that WBUR will reach the broadest possible audience in all the ways that people want to listen, read, engage, and learn today. Lastly, there is a need to bring people together to create connections, encourage conversation, and bridge differences. CitySpace is where this will happen. It will be Boston's much needed home for intellectual inquiry, cultural expression, and civic conversation. We have achieved much of our vision already. Tonight's celebration of the opening of CitySpace is obviously an important milestone. That said, we still need to raise a total of $12 million, $3.5 million to program CitySpace, another $3 million for local journalism, and $5.5 million for innovation. If you think about the fact that locally over 500,000 people listen to WBUR for at least 4 hours each week, it's reasonable to argue that WBUR touches often than any other institution in Boston, more than any museum, any hospital, or any theater. So many people rely on WBUR to make sense of their world. It's critical to position this great Boston institution to serve us better now and for generations to come. The success of all of this starts with people like you in this room. Our campaign objectives are ambitious. Together, we're not only shaping the future of public media, but we will also build a more informed, empowered, and inspired public. At this time in our history, at this inflection point, there is no better investment. I ask you to please join us with your support of this endeavor. Margot, our children, and I support a variety of organizations because of needs that we see in the world and our desire to work to make the world a better place by addressing those needs. All of this is true about our support for WBUR, but there is a difference in that we also benefit personally from the fact that BUR exists. In fact, we cannot imagine a world without it. Thank you all for being with us tonight and for caring about WBUR and public broadcasting. And it's now my pleasure to turn it over to Charlie. Thanks.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce our headliners for tonight. Jill Abramson is the author of the new book, Merchants of Truth, The Business of News and the Fight for Facts. She is a senior lecturer at Harvard University. She also writes a bi-weekly column for The Guardian about U.S. politics. She spent 17 years in the most senior editorial positions at the New York Times, where she was the first woman to serve as Washington bureau chief, managing editor, and executive editor. Before joining the Times, she spent 9 years at the Wall Street Journal. Interviewing her tonight is David Folkenflik, who serves as media correspondent for NPR News and as host and editor of On Point from NPR and WBUR, along with Meghna Chakrabarti. He broadcasts from New York each Friday. I couldn't resist quoting from his online bio, which says, quote, David Folkenflik was described by Geraldo Rivera of Fox News as, quote, a really weak-kneed, backstabbing, sweaty-palmed reporter. Others have been kinder. The Columbia Journalism Review, for example, once gave him a laurel for reporting that immediately led the U.S. military to institute safety measures for journalists in Baghdad. Ladies and gentlemen, Jill Abramson and David Folkenflik.
Well, quite a crowd. We can't quite see you, but we feel you.
You're very blue.
You're very blue. So first, before we begin, it feels incredibly fitting that this event focuses on journalism, focuses as a celebration both of what Jill has done and the issues that she's exploring and the meat of what we're talking about, but also of what WBUR does with partners like NPR every day. And I just got to say, before we start, I'd like to say a thank you to each of you and give each of you a round of applause for helping make this possible and for helping make BUR possible. So thank you very much. Welcome, Jill Abramson.
Thank you, David.
In addition,
It's cool that we're like the first speakers in this amazing, like,
it's pretty good.
yeah.
I think it's all downhill from here.
We better be fascinated.
You better be fascinating. I'm just asking questions. It's you know, I'm happy to put you on the spot here tonight. So, Jill Abramson, you wrote a book called The Merchants of Truth, in which you focused on a little paper called the New York City Times, the Washington Post, BuzzFeed, and Vice. Why those four?
Well, I felt that, you know, Charlie was eloquently talking about this time of turbulence in the news media, which has been the same arc as, you know, all of my editing jobs, certainly. And I loved a book called The Powers That Be by David Folkenflik. And when he wrote that book, it, you know, was published in 1979, he was illustrating a period when, after President Nixon's resignation, the news media was riding high. It was the golden age. He even argued that the news media had become more powerful in certain ways than the government. And that book was one of my inspirations for becoming a journalist. So what did I do? I copied his template. You know, picking four places worked for him.
So he did Times, CBS, the Washington Post, the LA Times.
Right. And what I was trying to illustrate is an incredibly interesting period filled with comedy, tragedy, tumult, achievement, and, you know, it was, you know, it's almost a cliche, the period of the great digital disruption, which did disrupt everybody. It disrupted the Times and the Post, which I would argue are the two most important national news organizations. They break the most important stories. I mean, the Wall Street Journal, where I worked for almost a decade, is a wonderful news organization, but, you know, it really specializes in business news.
Well, it hit their stride in the last year, it seems like. A lot of news
yeah,
on the...
they've broken a bunch of stories. Michael Cohen, kind of, they own that. But, you know, I felt that both, you know, at the Washington Post, you had new ownership. You had the Graham family, which is so famous. You know, Katharine Graham herself, when she was publisher, won a Pulitzer Prize for her great memoir. And her son, Don Graham, and her granddaughter, Catherine Weymouth, were just fighting against terrible odds to keep the Washington Post going. But every year they faced deeper and deeper cuts, and they had to start slashing their newsroom.
I want to ask you about the new digital players in a moment, about BuzzFeed and Vice, but it is interesting because you have these two great giants. I guess the president the other day said, you know, in being interviewed by reporters from the Times, what you know, I can go to my meetings later. What's more important than the New York Times, right?
Well, I remember, you know, he came to lunch, this is long before he was a political candidate, and he brought Don Jr. with him. He'd never been to the Times, and he just was in awe. And he made a point of saying he wanted his son to see the New York Times and what a great institution it was. Of course, now it's the failing New York Times, the king of fake news. But
a great and failing institution.
an institution he is uniquely sensitive to.
Well, one of the amazing things about the president, of course, is that despite his attacks on the press, he is desperate for its affirmation constantly and hopes to bask in it. There was, of course, the ad just recently taken by the Washington Post, in which Tom Hanks, you know, the star of the Post,
and Saving Private Ryan.
And Saving Private Ryan, right.
A symbol of patriotism.
Right. Narrated an ad that was essentially an ode to the glories of journalism, the necessity of it, in which it incorporated reporters from the Post, but not solely the Post. and also people from various outlets, including CNN and, in the case of Brett Baer, Fox News. What did you make of that spot?
I thought it was terrific. And Jane Mayer and I, in the fall, gave the T.H. White lecture at Harvard. And our big message was, it is time for the news media and quality news organizations to defend the importance of what journalists do and the fundamental role we have played in protecting democracy since the time of the founders. It just, after hammering from conservatives, hammering from the president, it's like really time to speak out. And I thought the ad, which I imagine all of you saw in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl, it cost approximately $5 million, which is like a penny for Jeff Bezos, who bought the Washington Post from the Grahams and has been a good steward of it. But, he has been kind of the target of Trump's taunting. He calls it the Amazon Washington Post, even though Bezos bought it personally. He, accuses Bezos of not paying his fair share of state taxes. So I think he's really, specifically and personally, angered the owner of the Washington Post. And what he chose to show in that spot, is a 60-second spot. It begins on D-Day, so you hear Tom Hanks and you're immediately thinking, Saving Private Ryan.
Right.
And, and then it shows everything you talked about. But I think most importantly, the spot ends by showing really brave journalists who went out in the most dangerous parts of the world to dig and bring information to the people. Marie Colvin, who died in a bombing in Syria. Of course, Khashoggi, who was slaughtered in the Saudi embassy and was a Washington Post. And just that, I thought, was so powerful. I chose to dedicate my book to my friend, Danny Pearl, who was killed chasing, a story after 9/11, and to every other journalist who risks their lives or gives their lives to, ferret out important information that is vital for the public to know and defending democracy. It's just vital that we re-emphasize. It's sad that we have to.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the First Amendment is first for a reason, but I think people may have kind of lost track of why the Fourth Estate exists.
Well, so, you talk about the vital role that journalism plays. You've represented that. I mean, before you were ever an editor, you were the quintessential accountability reporter, right? Exposing people's ties to money and influence and exposing
Money and
abuse of power,
politics was
right?
my turf.
Yeah.
But you donors are perfect. The best illustration of money and civic commitment.
Never were lobbyists happier than when she announced she was retreating to faculty, I think. So in that case, how is the press doing in terms of holding powerful figures, powerful agencies, government entities accountable right now in this age in which, at many times, as your book deftly illustrates, its finances are so corroded and so challenged?
Challenge, absolutely. I think I'm going to start with the plus and my optimism. I'm an optimist. I think that the investigative journalism that the Times, the Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, where I write a column, and the networks have, from time to time, had important stories. Think like we wouldn't know anything about the contours of the Mueller investigation without these news organizations. It's some of the best journalism I've read, and it's been kind of thrilling to see an old-fashioned newspaper war break out between the Times and the Post. So, some of it has been magnificent, but some of it has just been too reactive to Donald Trump.
So tell us what that means.
Because he is the master manipulator of the news media. Starring on The Apprentice for 20 seasons, he built the myth of Donald Trump, the gold-plated, successful businessman who has the power, in an instant to decide who's worthy and who's not. And he remade himself. He was, a bankrupted real estate developer in New York City before The Apprentice. So he knows the power of television, and he has figured out how the news cycle works, how you can dominate it, say something outrageous that, sorry, we reporters are like kids playing soccer. We don't stay in position and we run for the ball. And, so that bothers me. But he is the president. We have to cover him. There are norms of White House reporting that are pretty tough to just stop doing. I think the networks were probably right to agree to carry the president's speech about the crisis at the border live, but there was not a drop of news in it. And at least now, the news media has an excuse not to do it the next time if they think it's not worthwhile.
Yeah, I questioned why somebody in one of these outlets somewhere didn't decide to do a different version, and at the same time, the Republic endured, when they did that. You talk about Trump's ability to manipulate the rhythms of the press, essentially, and take advantage of those things. It seemed to me, and you also talk about his record, sort of a Potemkin billionaire in some ways, and developer, right? Where there wasn't nearly as much behind the facade as people might think. At the same time, it seemed to me...
And also how he inherited his money. I mean, not enough people could get through the whole thing, but the Times' investigation of how he inherited his money starting at age 3 from his father, and how the whole family escaped paying gift taxes is, if you haven't read it, you have to.
It's fabulous, and if you look online, you can hover over and look at the original documents, and it's an unbelievable thing. One of the things I would look at the Times in particular, I'd say is, they've done such incredible enterprise reporting since he's been in office, but as he points out, every time he feels snubbed by the Times, it's his hometown paper, and he wants respect from the Times. I was amazed the degree to which the Times resisted doing deep dives on his record in New York during the primaries, where Republican voters are assessing these things. He was a guy. They'd said, well, we did that, but it turned out they'd done the reporting in the '90s, and not when it counted in the primary
and
for
Tim
people to evaluate.
O'Brien, who some of you see on MSNBC, wrote a really good book about that part of Trump's. The problem with the reportage of everyone, and the Times is always seen as a leader of everyone else, even in the disaggregated, crazy world of digital news. The Times still is an agenda setter. And, Hillary Clinton looked, from certainly before the primaries ended, she looked like the likely president. There were not many reporters who thought Donald Trump even had a chance to win. So the investigative firepower was really, in a disproportionate way, focused on Hillary, and there weren't enough really deep dives on Trump. And of course, I'm pretty critical of the Times' email coverage in my book. I mean, it was their scoop that she had a private email server, but you would have thought it was a grave crime on the level of Watergate. There were so many of these stories, and you know, the Shorenstein Center at Harvard, you know, did a big study and, you know, came up with the unsurprising results that Hillary Clinton got much more negative coverage than Trump did. But, you know, we were all, and I was guilty too. I mean, The Guardian still has in their computer system the 7,000 word piece I wrote about the meaning of the first woman president. I mean, practically every reporter just operated on that assumption. And, you know, it's sort of tragic looking back. Not that I think more investigative articles would have necessarily made a difference, but they should have been done.
Right, one of the things that was interesting in that Post commercial was the idea that I thought was articulated nicely, whether or not one felt that was a good use of, you know, probably 10 million put to a different journalistic end. Nonetheless, I thought Hanks's narration summarized nicely the idea is you're equipping people to be citizens, you're giving them the information they need to make whatever choices they want to make, which seemed right.
Which is exactly what the founders intended.
One of the interesting developments of the past couple of years, the extent to which there are other players. If you look at BuzzFeed, which plays one of the central roles in your narrative of your book, BuzzFeed has broken a lot of stories.
Including they were, you know, the first to publish the entire Steele dossier, which turned into a big controversy.
Well, there's that controversy, and more recently another where the question was they have a scoop and it's remained a scoop, which is always a very uncomfortable place for a news organization to be, particularly after Mueller's people somewhat knocked it down.
Yeah, they did, which is very unusual. They are, you know, the special no comment counsel's office. So.
But I think it's very interesting. In your book, you know, even now people say, well, BuzzFeed, that's a place where you get listicles about cats, and that's all you get from them. And actually, no, they've got a lot of very sophisticated people doing news there as something of a lost leader for the organization. How did it come to be that BuzzFeed has been able to do serious news and do it in a competitive way, at times beating places like the Post and the Times?
Well, Jonah Peretti, who founded BuzzFeed, his original vision and interest was how does information go viral? And so listicles, funny quizzes, you know, amusing things for what he called the Bored at Work network was what Jonah Peretti and BuzzFeed specialized in. But, you know, they wanted to class up their brand. And, you know, it got to the point in 2012 where the only content they weren't doing was news. And, you know, Peretti, like BuzzFeed, had grown up, and he decided he wanted to jump into news and hired a great editor, Ben Smith, who'd been at Politico, and, you know, was the master, which fit sort of with virality of the, what I call scooplet, you know, the big scoop about some inside piece of campaign gossip that lasts half a news cycle or a whole news cycle. But he hired and trained a team of really good political writers, including the daughter of Richard Ben Kramer, who wrote my favorite political book, What It Takes, lots of other talented people. And, you know, within a couple of years, they had a 20-journalist investigative unit that did great work, including a piece about Russian hits and murders of oligarchs in London that was a finalist for a Pulitzer last year.
And done by the guy who was one of the two reporters on this disputed story.
Right. I mean, you know, I'm hoping that that story does eventually prove to be true, because the most recent documents from Mueller got like this close to Trump, you know, ordering, it's not identified, his, you know, confidants and minions through Roger Stone to find out what WikiLeaks had. And so it doesn't seem unbelievable to me that he would have, you know, directed, I think the word they used might be off, because, Trump, if he's anything, is canny, and, maybe the words weren't as explicit. Something is off because, Mueller knocked it down and he doesn't ever comment, but I think the contours and most of that story will turn out to be true. That does not mean that they published perhaps too hastily, which, happened while I was at the Times too, occasionally.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to see BuzzFeed.
But they matter.
They matter. They're a player in the book. You tell the story of how, and I remember this as a reporter covering media, how suddenly they had to think about, do we need an ethics policy? Do we need to suddenly? There was this episode where essentially Ben Smith decides to like David Copperfield, disappear 400 articles. They just vanish from the site without announcement because he realized they didn't sustain any kind of scrutiny as news postings, but BuzzFeed hadn't started as a news organization.
And they mixed advertising with news. In the early days, BuzzFeed had the same people writing, native ads and posts.
And explain what native ads are for those.
Native ads are, advertisements, usually video or television ads that and print too, the Times now does them, that mimic almost exactly the journalism of wherever the native ads are placed. Like, unsurprisingly, BuzzFeed, had a very profitable native ad campaign about Friskies that, adorable kittens, chain photographs was BuzzFeed's staple. And so the ad just seems like another, adorable kitten.
And they were, part of what BuzzFeed...
And the Times has, something like operating right at the Times called T-Brand Studios, which does native advertising for an array of clients. And, on the homepage of the Times, they have a little thing that says paid post, but not everybody knows what that means or even absorbs it. And, again, I don't like confusing readers or an audience about what's ads and what's news. And the stuff Ben Smith erased sort of didn't smell right because it was merged.
Well, let's turn to stuff that I was desperately trying to get out of you a few years back, but was unable to do, but was able to read about a bit more in your book. Some of the things you're talking about right now, the question of whether lines needed to be blurred between rigid differentiation of the business side interests and the journalism side interests, the creation of these paid content or native ads or whatever you want to call these that sort of, advertorial inhabited this middle space between news and advertising. That was part of the tension that you felt as executive editor of this important paper with your bosses, that is with Arthur Sulzberger Jr., the publisher and ultimate owner, and with Mark Thompson, the CEO.
Right, who was the brand new CEO.
Brought in from the BBC. Right. And his notion was, you're going to have to give me this on a few occasions. He wanted you to yield and allow more flexibility. In retrospect, was he right? Has the Times maintained the purity of what it's done, or has this in some ways blurred the distinction between what is at times purely news creation and what's Times content?
Well, I don't think any news organization has total purity, but when the Times was a print product, there was like a very tall wall between the business side, particularly advertising, and the news side. But that wall was lowered over the course of my career. I oppose native advertising. I oppose making paid conferences with sponsors from Wall Street and other places that with high dollar, entrance fees, that was not the Times to me.
Were you right?
And, you know, I have to say, there has been no, hint of scandal involving anything like that at the Times. But, when there's a conference where Andrew Ross Sorkin, who covers, Wall Street and big companies, is the headliner, and Accenture, which is a regulated financial company, is the sponsor, paying a lot of money, and the person that Sorkin is interviewing is the head of the SEC, which is someone he covers. It seems to me that when famous public figures appear in conferences, they're doing a favor for the Times. And no, I don't have any evidence that Andrew went soft on the SEC or, has written nice things about Accenture, but it really worried me, and I wanted the wall to stay higher, maybe not as high as it had been for the print newspaper, but even when we went digital, the person who was the director of digital operations had been the head of advertising at the newspaper. And she said to me about native advertising, because I hadn't really heard of it, and I asked her about it. She said, the Times would never do that. But, now they do, and, so be it. Maybe, and I say this in my book, maybe, my ethical strictures were too tight. But, they were an illustration and came from just my strong sense of ethics and morals and never confusing anybody. So, I just couldn't get with the program. And the program was important because, as David, who knows more about this than almost anyone, knows, the Times desperately needed new revenue streams. When I was both managing editor and executive editor. And, often these decisions boil down to, Bill Keller used to joke, you get to the point where if you want the Baghdad Bureau to stay open, just let them do it if it's going to, accomplish that. And maybe that's right, but the Post had a scandal, involving too much blurring of lines that was called Salongate, where Catherine Weymouth, the publisher, was asking lobbyists to pay like $25,000 to sponsor a dinner. They got to come to her house for dinner and mix with reporters who covered, if it was a healthcare lobbyist, healthcare. And the invitations were sent out.
All off the record.
Politico, I think, right, all off the record, that's important. Politico got hold of an investigation, did a story on it, and, the whole Salon program had to be canceled, and it should never have been proposed.
It's always a bad thing when the newspaper that owned Watergate has a scandal with the suffix "gate" attached to it.
Right,
I think that's never a good thing.
Right.
I want to, in just a minute or two, take some of your questions because we want to hear those as well. I do want to ask, Jeff
We
Bezos.
haven't talked about Vice at all, and the fact that Vice and BuzzFeed, I don't mean to
No, go for it. It's your
Q,
book.
He's the Q, I'm supposed to be the A,
That's
but,
right.
they were, when I was fired from the Times, we haven't talked about that
Well, I was
either,
just
but,
about to. But,
anyway.
Certain A's preempted that.
But BuzzFeed and Vice were the shiny new stars of news at
it's crazy.
point
So
I
Vice,
left, and they're in terrible trouble now.
the amazing arc of the book, in some ways, is you have
That
these
surprise roll.
You have these upstarts that you're explaining the origin stories. In Vice's case, this bad boy laddie magazine about music. Montreal. These guys come down and end up doing it here and blowing it out, and they promote, I mean, half of the story is about the image they promoted themselves as bad guys, even as they're desperate to strike deals ultimately with major figures in media and ultimately be on TV, you know, because they say that's where we're going to make real money. And by the end, they've accepted so much money and they have such artificially inflated valuations, they can't sustain and keep making the profits their investors need them to make.
I think BuzzFeed and Vice both hope to be acquired, but you know, BuzzFeed's valuation was, you know, recently 1.7 billion, and Vice's was almost 6 billion.
$6 billion,
that's
well over
crazy.
any, you know, the New York Times or anything else.
There's little evidence that either of them turned a profit, and you know, they're in big trouble now because both of them use social media. BuzzFeed used Facebook. YouTube launched Vice, and Google owns that. So, but now the hosts are eating up all the advertising revenue, and you know, as I said, the shiny new players are in deep, you know what.
All right, so we'll come back to you in a moment. First, I want to take a few questions, folks. I believe microphones will be distributed out there if I can see you out there. Let's see where we have a couple of questions. Show of hands. We have some on this side, I see. Right in back, please, and then we'll come forward to you.
Thank you very much. One of the more fascinating aspects of journalism is not what gets printed, but what doesn't get printed. How has the protocol around what doesn't get printed changed today versus 10, 20 years ago?
Well, those of you who saw the movie of The Post, you know, the movie The Post, know that, you know, both the Times and the Washington Post, you know, made brave decisions to publish the Pentagon Papers when the Nixon administration was telling them, you know, they got injunctions that stopped the Times from publishing for a number of days. But then the Supreme Court, thank God, ruled that there can't be, you know, prior censorship for something that's published. You can only try to prosecute anyone, and unfortunately that's been the sources for national security stories that involve, you know, classified information. It's the sources, not the news organizations, that incur huge legal fees, and you know, a couple of reporters have gone to jail. But the decision not to publish during my career at the Times was so rare. You know, after 9/11, when I was Washington bureau chief, there were, you know, at least a dozen requests from the Bush administration that the Times not publish stories that involved counterterror programs. But in most cases, we were able to publish a story and take out maybe some details that I felt were not crucial to convey the information readers needed. But you know, no one elected me to, you know, be the big decider of what stories could actually harm the country and which don't. And it was only the experience of having to make those decisions and apply a balancing test. And weighing towards publication was always, does the public benefit from knowing this information? As opposed to, are you going to, you know, help terrorists, which is what President Bush told, you know, the publisher of the New York Times, you know, that he would have blood on his hands if we published the first story about NSA eavesdropping. And the Times was criticized because we held that story for more than a year.
The warrantless wiretapping story.
Yeah, but
Were you right?
I think we should have published it way sooner, but you know,
So one question off this is, has the pace or the way in which those decisions get made been changed by the relentlessly quickening digital nature of how news is done now? So explain that.
The speed of the web, you know, has had a tremendous effect on almost every aspect of journalism. But just as an illustration, with the Steele dossier, CNN in the afternoon had a story saying that both Trump and Obama in the period before Trump's inauguration had been briefed by the FBI about the contents of the Steele dossier, which was an important story, but they did not just put the dossier online because it did have unverified information in it. But boom, very quickly, within a mere number of hours, BuzzFeed decided that, well, if essentially two presidents were briefed on it, it's important information, and let's let the public decide whether they should see it or not. That's their ethos.
And how comfortable are you with that? Because once they decide that, we all have it. Like, it's not like they decide it and only,
I mean, many news organizations had the Steele dossier before the Republican convention. So, I think there's something too when, I thought Ben Smith had a good argument that I supported, that the fact that they'd been briefed was the dossier, so unfair and so filled with inaccuracies that the public couldn't see it when every major news organization had had it for months, but I don't think, there's everything should be put out there.
So you're differentiating yourself from somebody else with the initials JA. You are not Julian Assange. You have a different approach. There's got to be some choices made here, some discretion shown.
And you mentioned Julian Assange, and I'm thinking when I was managing editor of the Times, and Bill Keller was the executive editor, we partnered with publish the first material, the Chelsea Manning material about the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which were very critical of aspects of the war. And then, we did a second tranche, which were the Diplo cables. And, we eventually, we didn't break the Snowden material, but we got hold of it and we did publish it. And I look back and I, wonder, were we all, manipulated by someone who was tied to Russia and the goal of undermining Americans' faith in Western institutions and American policy? I don't know that, and Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, practically wants to gag me when I talk about this.
But I remember
it's a question that makes me toss and turn.
Let me just say, it's incredibly striking to hear you say that. I do remember at the time when I talked to Bill Keller about that deal. He didn't want to use the word partnership. He says, we're just happening to obtain information from
Well, he said
them.
WikiLeaks was our source,
right,
which is true.
But it was a more hybrid amphibian role, right? I mean, they were a source, they were kind of a partner or collaborator, not in dictating what you publish, but in getting
the material to the news media.
It's a very interesting implication.
But that's not so different from Daniel Ellsberg, who we celebrate as, an important whistleblower.
But if you watch the movie and remember the time or have done the things, like Ellsberg also was more than just sort of a source who happened to take a call. Like, he was, in a sense, a collaborator of the Washington Post and Bagadikian and getting them the information. Like,
after he gave it to the Times.
Yes.
The Times was first.
Let no one mistake that. And even if you saw the movie and enjoyed it.
My constantly, when I'm talking about my book, which does have some criticism, some specifically of my time as executive editor. I feel like I'm constantly promoting them.
Well, and I do want to get to one or two more questions, but let's come to that, because the picture that emerges of Arthur Sulzberger Jr., your former boss, and at that time the controlling owner of the paper. I guess he's still chairman of the Times Company, but he seems intent on doing certain things business-wise that you are uncomfortable with, and yet you speak admiringly of his desire to protect as much as possible the journalism, really sustain it, and you admire that even though he paid usurious interest on this 14% loan to Carlos Slim, that nonetheless he got the paper through this incredible era.
Crisis.
And yet, you know, he seems to have not really connected.
He fired, and what you want to say is, he fired my you-know-what, you know?
He fired you, and what was interesting in your book is he also fired, just before that, the female CEO.
Right, who was very much my mentor and promoter.
How much did, I never understood her firing, it was never really explained. How much did you feel that gender play a role in the way in which Sulzberger dealt with these two top first female CEO, first female executive editor, both fired sort of summarily?
You know, it's a great question, and I wish I had a clear answer. He was someone who never felt like comfortable around many people, some men, some women. You know, he had, when I was 8 years managing editor, never, you know, given me any kind of evaluation. I had no idea whether he thought I was doing a good job or a mediocre job. And so, like, when I was alone with him once, I went for it. And I said, you know, Arthur, you've never told me. I'm just curious, you know, what kind of job do you think I'm doing as managing editor? And his only response was, and he seemed really like uncomfortable that I was asking, was, oh, Jill, you know, you're my go-to girl.
Go-to girl.
And no, that isn't like what I wanted to hear. But, you know, he is, a big issue for him was diversity in the newsroom. I felt like I had his support. After 1 year as executive editor, the masthead, which is the most important editors at the Times, was half female for the first time. And I felt like he had my back on that and support. So, like, I'm not sure, but I think he found both Janet Robinson and me to be pushy. He felt, you know, when we didn't agree with him that we weren't annoying. You know, I see those qualities, you know, somewhat in the two of us. But let's face it, when men act in the same way, you know, they aren't seen as pushy or too aggressive. They're seen as leaderly. And there have been many studies that when women get the top job, which is still all too rare, their likability goes down. And, you know, so, you know, I do think that, you know, gender figured into some of my lack of success, you know, as executive editor. I do feel that I was unfairly judged, but, you know, the part of the book where, you know, I get fired, it's the only part of the book, and it's a small part of the second chapter on the Times. I wrote in first person because I'm not going to write Abramson, or it's awkward. So, you know, I'm pretty self-critical in it. I say, you know, I wasn't the best manager, and, you know, I was a stickler for, you know, the ethics that I learned from a man called Al Siegel, who was the ethics czar at the Times, you know, forever. But
when I was a rookie reporter, a friend of mine, fresh out of college, had a 2-year job at the Times, Abby Goodenough, and she gave me what were called the greenies, where Al Siegel, the standards editor, would mark up, I guess, what had been done, and he would circle praise sometimes, and he would circle some tough things. I remember there was a sports headline about a horse, and it said, "A nagging question." And he circled it, and he said, if I recall correctly, he said, if this headline is intentionally relying on the pun, it is beneath contempt. And then he said, if inadvertent, it rises to contempt. I want to take a couple more questions out here. There was somebody up front here, I think, and then maybe on this side as well. Let's wait for the microphone, please. And please do say your first name. We'd like to hear who you are as well.
My name is Pam, and one of the things after the 2016 election is I stopped listening to all the news because I was so angry about the fact that falsehoods were never called lies. Now we start to see that, but why is everybody so afraid to call something a lie?
You want to take it? You want me to
I think it's
take
all
it?
you. They've come here for you. I'm happy to take it, but I'm interested in your judgment.
In the book, I talk about Dean Baquet did decide to put lie in a front page headline for a story where Trump was denying he had ever been a birther. And, that's a clear lie. And, I'm comfortable using the word lie. But the reason that Marty Barron, the editor of The Post, who's, fantastic, and most other publications don't use the word lie, as they feel the definition of a lie is the person has to have the intent to lie, and that because Trump picks up all these cockamamie things from Fox or whatever crazy right-wing news site he's been on, that he may not even know it's a lie. Now, yeah, I am not bound by that concern, but that's the reason, anyway, to answer your question. And I think lie is used less frequently now, that, it hasn't become more common, that, it's called falsehoods and misstatements and other words.
I think at NPR they don't have a ban on it, and I've tested it once or twice, and that is true, but that there's a desire to feel that there's an appreciable way to indicate intent, and that is if the president clearly has the information that contradicts this and repeats it regardless, or if there's some public statement or email or something that shows that there's an intent to deceive or whatever, there's doing that. Sometimes I feel as though whether or not you call it a lie is less important than how you approach it and how you cover it and how you frame it, and making sure people get good information and that it's explicitly articulated they're not getting good information in the body of the story, the segment, the treatment of the coverage itself, rather than just simply segmented in an important fact-checking thing, but that's completely separate from the coverage itself. But that is a tension, and you hear that debate within newsrooms as well. There's some questions on this side.
This is the quiet side. Come on.
They're playing politely.
Come
We have a
on
question. We have a
down.
couple questions on this side here.
Hi, my name is Margaret, and I had a question that really is very concerning to me, which is, how do you strike the balance between covering a president who clearly knows the cycle of news and manipulates the news with his never-ending tweets, and things that are happening in all of the different cabinet offices, like the Department of Interior or the EPA or the FDA, which are undercovered? I mean, there's a whole series of actions that have been taken that we don't really know about because Trump and his tweets takes up most of the news space.
Or what he said.
Or what he says, yeah. And it's just word for word what he says, so. It's a bothersome thing, because you're in a bind. You're in a bind.
Because it's a manipulation. It is. But in my book, I also say, and this is just obvious, like people at the Times were angry that I wrote this, but there is an implicit financial motive too, because all of those Trump stories get a huge number of clicks, and getting, a big audience, first of all, feeds the egos of the journalists who watch Chartbeat as if it's, an EKG to see how many readers they have. But it also, having a big audience helps with advertising. More people see your stories. And I had lunch recently with a Times journalist who, admitted to me when he doesn't write about Trump, his readership goes like this, and, it bothers him. So, there are two kinds of incentives to do it, plus Trump being the manipulator and being a combination of so bizarre, entertaining, and maybe a bit newsworthy that, you're drawn to it no matter what.
It'd be fair, Eric Lipton of the Times does these things
yeah.
about individual agencies. Politico helped bring down, I think, was it Pruitt or Tom Price maybe at HHS, one of those. I mean,
Yeah, 'cause
there's a
of his
long
stuff.
and storied list of cabinet
Right.
officers to look at these days for reporters.
But the ratio of Trump to those stories, which I agree are great, isn't good. If you want to read something fantastic on the cabinet offices and policies, Michael Lewis's new book is great, The Fifth Risk. He goes deep, and
Can I ask you one question? Because you've written about your concerns about the ability of the press to cover Trump, and particularly about the Times and sort of its tone and its approach. Maybe this is a gross overgeneralization, or maybe you disagree with this entirely. It seems to me that the Times, in some ways, has a lot more topspin on some of its coverage. And the Post, if I go to its website, seemingly to me has 8 to 12 bites at the same apple. That is, they're like, this is really hitting, and our numbers must be showing we're hitting, and they'll just have 6 or 7 or 12 different stories that are fundamentally about the same thing. Is that right?
Yes, I agree. In Merchants of Truth, I say this. The Post has, a couple of different apps and that I check in with during the day. And sometimes, it's 2 scrolls of my phone before I hit something that isn't Trump. And one of their apps even mixes in the opinion in between the news story. So it is a deluge.
Yeah.
The Times, I think some of the headlines are loaded unnecessarily. One story the other day had a front page headline or homepage headline that had, in a rebuke to Trump, New York changed something. And did you really need, to make it again about Trump? It's arguable. And what the tweets of many of our colleagues, I think, are way out there. I think tweeting, no journalist should tweet what they wouldn't say on the air or wouldn't publish. And so I think Twitter, yes, it helps journalists promote their own work, but is poison in many ways. And the other thing that troubles me is when great journalists from the Times, the Post, other places appear on MSNBC or CNN on those panels of 3. That's very cheap programming for the cable networks. But, and the journalist is usually in the middle. But I think for most viewers, when they're on with Michael Steele, who was head of the Republican Party, and then a Democratic political consultant, or a former prosecutor, who's tough on Trump, and someone else political, that, again, it's confusing to people watching. They're not necessarily keeping straight who's who. And the sum total is that panel seems really anti-Trump.
And the reporter very much part of that as a result, swept
I
along
think
for the ride.
it blends.
And yet I can tell you, even though...
Peter Baker and Maggie Haberman are admirably careful on cable. But,
yeah, but she comes out brawling on Twitter. One of the things about the Times is you talk about all these headlines that are, that are in rebuke to Trump. It seems to me that's in response to readers who are eating it up. At the same time, like Haberman, if she gets criticism or she gets pushback, man, you are reminded that she used to work for a tabloid. She comes out, boom. She is not gentle, right? And that's her approach.
Twitter thrives on conflict. That's its business model.
It is. All right, a couple questions in front and then in the back on this side, because we wrongly rebuked you as coming unarmed with questions.
Ken from Brookline. So as a citizen, should we watch Trump's speech tomorrow, or should we just read a good book? What are you going to do?
Watch him. It's a measure of how he thinks and what he said, what he views as important. And remember his first State of the Union, it was so dark. It was like a horror story, and it gave you an incredible glimpse into the man's outlook and like what he wants the public to believe. So watch it. I bet it'll be short.
A non-Clintonian approach.
And Stacey Abrams will be interesting in the rebuttal.
I think that this woman in the third row here, please.
Hi, I'm Tamar. I was wondering what your take is on kind of the next generation of journalists.
Who I teach.
And, kind of the dependence on clicks and on leveraging the internet, which is kind of necessary in every industry right now. And that kind of alongside all of the layoffs at BuzzFeed recently in their news department, right after this giant scoop that kind of needs to be defended. I mean, what do we do?
What I do, and it can't be scaled, unfortunately, is not every student who takes my class wants to be a journalist, but the ones that clearly have a passion and talent, I help them get starting jobs and have placed some people at Huffington Post, which has had cuts, at Vice and BuzzFeed for their starter jobs. So it does desperately worry me that all of them are cutting. And, I'm worried that I'm not going to be as effective as I have been in helping them. But so many, anywhere I speak, at any university, I do a fair amount of it, there are so many young, students, either at journalism school or undergraduates, they're dying to be journalists. And, my advice to anyone is always do what you love. And there are some jobs, but, it's a grim picture. But, there are plenty of great people who still want to jump in.
You got to want it. And if you do want it, and want to have an impact, it's probably best to do it on the local or regional level, where there's so much.
Although, look, hundreds of local papers have shuttered or been bought by these vulture funds that strip them down for parts. Old, glide path that was you start at a local paper, then get up to a regional paper, like, the Charlotte Observer, that has been blown out.
That's absolutely true. A couple quick questions here. We've got time for a few more, I think, before we got to wrap up.
Hi, Jill. Mary Jo Meissner. Thanks for your, as always, refreshingly straightforward and compelling conversation about journalism. I want to follow up on teaching at Harvard, which you've been doing for 5 years, and go deeper than, talking about journalism, but how do you find the students in terms of their understanding and appreciation for the First Amendment, the role of the Fourth Estate, their understanding of the, what role this is in our democracy and the importance of it? Sometimes I worry about that. And I'd love to hear you talk about, since you've had 5 years experience with that.
Right, and today was actually first spring class of my Introduction to Journalism seminar, and that's what we did today. And, clearly not every, people weren't yawning. It's like they weren't all familiar with this. And I showed them both the post-Super Bowl ad, and the New York Times had a great ad during the Academy Awards last year that was "Truth is Hard." I showed them that too, and asked them why they thought it was necessary to convey those messages, and from there segued almost immediately into the First Amendment and challenges to it, and why keep holding power accountable couldn't be more important right now, which is what the founders who had to live under an abusive king worried most about at the very dawn of this country. So I love teaching that, and at least the 12 people in my 2 seminars, definitely know it right off the bat during class.
So I'm going to offer one more question at the end of Jill's answer. I'll thank her and we'll applaud her, and then I'll just have a brief thought after that. That's a little production thing because we're going to use some of this, we think, for an upcoming show. So what do you think, guys? This gentleman up front here.
Hi.
Can we wait one moment? You tell us your name and also use the microphone there, sir.
My name is Sherman. Two related questions. What was your sense of what happened with Judith Miller and the story about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? And the other, the manner in which the New York Times handled the ICIJ.
The what?
The
Sorry.
ICIJ Obermeyer research.
The Panama Papers?
The Panama and Paradise Papers.
All right, that's for her graduate level class. I think that'll be offered next fall as a seminar.
That's a lot. I'll do Judith Miller.
Take Judy and we'll do that.
I mean, Judy Miller and many reporters in Washington, were relying on sources who were Iraqi defectors who had no current information about Saddam Hussein's supposed weapons programs, and they were going to hardliners inside the White House, like Scooter Libby, or at the Department of Energy, where there was belief that these centrifuges were imported by Iraq for building nuclear weapons. And so it was this horrible echo chamber where Judy thought she had 2-source confirmation, but all she had is people inside the government who had heard the same thing from the Iraqi defectors as she had. And this was a problem. The Times put her stories on the front page, led the paper with it, which was terrible. A news organization that had really good analysts at the CIA who really thought the evidence was a bunch of BS. The reporters from McClatchy's bureau in Washington were on that. Now, McClatchy doesn't have an outlet in Washington.
Or New York.
So, many of us were not seeing their stories or following up on them. And, it was, a terrible chapter in recent journalism.
Unvarnished truth from a merchant of truth. Jill Abramson, thank you so much.
Thanks.
And I wanted to say one thing for the hometown folks here at WBUR and at NPR, at public radio. One of the things I like is the sense that it is not a safe space, but a civil and civic space where we can cover things hard, try to break news, competing with some folks who have a lot of horsepower and knowledge on how to do it, and also to offer an arena and forum in which we hash some of these things out, hopefully that we don't acknowledge our disagreements, but to do it in a way where some insight can be yielded. When I was a young reporter covering Congress for the Baltimore Sun a little over 20 years ago, one of the people I covered was then Senator Paul Sarbanes, or Sarbanes, as the people who knew him well. He had grown up on the eastern shore of Maryland, the son of a couple that ran, Greek immigrants. They ran a diner on the eastern shore of Maryland. And he, at one point, sort of took me by the lapel. He said, "David, do you know what an idiot is?" I knew that I would not have his answer. I said, "Tell me, Senator." And he said, "You know, in Greece, ancient Greece, an idiot was somebody who didn't vote. It wasn't somebody who was dumb. It was somebody who didn't care enough to be involved and engaged in the civic sphere. All of you guys are engaged in the civic sphere. Thank you for doing it. Thank you for your support, and thank you for coming out tonight."